The visit that no one expected. The house was quieter than it had ever been. Not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the kind that lingers in the corners of the room, crawling over the wooden floors and pressing gently against the heart. It had been years since she last heard his voice echo through these halls. Years since the familiar scent of leather jackets and motorcycle grease had mixed with the aroma of her morning coffee. Sandra stood in the middle of the living room, barefoot, in an old sweater he once said made her look like comfort itself. And she wasn't sure if she was imagining the sound of tires outside, or if it was just her heart playing tricks on her again. She had stopped waiting. That was the truth, stopped hoping. Hollywood had aged around them, the world had changed, he had changed, and so had she. Life had moved on, or so she told herself, but something inside her had never quite sealed shut. There were corners of her soul still waiting for one more word, one more explanation, one more visit that would make sense of the storm he left behind. And today, without warning, the storm was outside her gate. Her assistant had said someone was at the front door, but didn't mention a name. Only that the man refused to come in until Sandra herself opened it. That should have been her first clue. Only one person in her life ever respected her space so deeply that he'd rather stand in the rain than walk in uninvited. Only one man had loved her so fiercely, and then vanished so quietly. She hesitated by the door, her hand trembling just above the knob. She could already feel the weight of old emotions pressing against her chest, grief, anger, longing, and something far more dangerous than any of those, hope. She turned the knob slowly. The hinges groaned, as if even the house knew it had been too long. And there he was. Keanu Reeves stood just beyond the porch, hands in the pockets of his long black coat, hair a little longer than she remembered, face older, but those eyes were the same. Kind, deep, haunted. His voice broke the silence before she could find her own. "I didn't know if you'd open the door." For a moment, Sandra just stared at him, unable to speak, unsure if he was real. Time stood still. It was as if the years melted away and she was 28 again, standing on a set in between takes, laughing at his dry humor and wondering why every room felt more alive when he was in it. And then her voice came, fragile but steady. "I didn't know you still had my address." "I never forgot it," he said softly. "I never forgot anything." The air between them was thick with things unsaid. Keanu stepped forward only when she moved aside, granting him entry. As he passed her, he didn't touch her, but she felt the chill of his absence dissipate for the first time in years. They sat across from each other in the living room. She curled her legs under her on the couch. He remained still in the armchair like a man unsure whether he belonged. His eyes scanned the room, a photo of her and her son on the shelf, a faded script on the coffee table, a candle half burned, and a framed picture tucked discreetly behind others of the two of them on the set of a forgotten film, laughing. "I thought you were gone for good," Sandra finally said. "I thought I was too," he replied. "But then I realized there was one thing I hadn't done, one person I hadn't said goodbye to properly." Her throat tightened. "Is that why you're here, to say goodbye?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out something small and folded. He set it on the table between them but didn't push it toward her. She looked at it, then at him. "What is it?" "My final script," he said quietly, "but it's not for Hollywood." She slowly leaned forward, picked it up, and unfolded the single sheet. It was handwritten, messy, raw, not a script in the traditional sense, but more like a confession. Her eyes flicked over the words, and then froze. "You wrote this?" "Yes." Her fingers trembled as she reached the final lines. They were simple, devastating, honest. "If I'm remembered for anything in this world, let it be this." I loved her in silence, in absence, in every moment I never got to say it. And now, before the curtain falls, I say it out loud. Her breath caught. "Why now, Keanu?" He leaned back, eyes misted with a sadness that went deeper than words. "Because I thought I had more time, we all do, but sometimes the end comes not with a bang, but with a whisper. I got news, Sandra. I didn't want to make a scene, but I don't have years, I don't even have months." Her hand flew to her mouth. "No." He gave a soft smile. "It's okay, I've made peace with it, but before I go, I needed you to know that the best thing that ever happened to me wasn't a movie or a moment in the spotlight. It was you." The tears began before she could stop them. Slow, silent, sacred. He stood then as if preparing to leave, but her voice stopped him. "You can't just drop this and walk away again." "I don't want to," he whispered, But I don't know if I should stay. Then don't think, she said, rising to her feet. Just stay. And for the first time in years, he stepped forward, not as a ghost from her past, but as a man standing fully in the present. She reached for his hand and he took it, firm, warm, real. Outside, the rain had stopped, but inside, something had just begun. The room where time stopped. The rain had quieted into a distant hum, a background melody to a moment that neither of them could name. In that stillness, in that fragile silence held between two people who once meant everything to each other and now barely knew how to stand in the same room, something sacred began to stir. Sandra sat beside Keanu, not too close, but not far either. Close enough to feel the warmth of his presence and far enough to hide the trembling in her fingers. She clutched the folded letter in her lap like a memory she wasn't ready to open, even though she had already read every word of it twice, maybe 3 times in her mind. Her eyes kept drifting toward him, not because she needed to confirm he was really there, but because she didn't know how much longer she had before he wouldn't be. Keanu had always been a quiet soul, someone who didn't speak to fill the air but waited until words were necessary. And right now, every second of silence felt necessary. There was no performance here, no spotlight, just a man weathered by time and pain, sitting in the home of a woman who once lit up his entire world. And yet that world had slipped through both their hands like water. Now they were left with what remained, fragments of laughter, decades-old promises, and truths too heavy to carry alone. I thought you had forgotten me, Sandra said finally, her voice steady but thick with something far older than hurt. You left, not just once, but completely. There were years, Keanu, years when I needed a friend, years when I looked for your name in messages or hoped to hear you were at some award night or that you'd come to my son's birthday, but you vanished like a ghost. Keanu didn't flinch. His gaze remained soft, but his jaw tightened just slightly, a sign that her words had found their mark. He turned his head slowly, eyes meeting hers, and what she saw there was not guilt, but grief. I didn't forget, he said, his voice gravelly. I couldn't forget if I tried. Every room I walked into, every sunset I saw, I thought of you. But I was broken back then, Sandra, more than I ever told anyone. I wasn't strong enough to carry what we had, and I didn't want to infect your light with my darkness. She inhaled deeply, trying to keep the flood at bay. You could have told me. You could have let me carry it with you. And what if I said I didn't believe I deserved that? He asked, a rare edge in his tone. What if I spent years convincing myself that the best way to love you was to leave you untouched by my chaos? Sandra stood, almost suddenly, as if the room had become too small for the weight pressing down on her chest. She walked toward the fireplace and stared at the old, faded photos above the mantel, snapshots of a life she had built without him, yet always imagined he'd somehow reappear in. She didn't turn as she spoke. You never asked me what I was willing to lose. You just decided you weren't enough and made that the truth. You think I was untouched by your chaos? Keanu, I lived in it. In the absence. In the silence. Every time I saw your name trending online or a new photo of you smiling with a stranger, I died a little more. He rose then, quietly, and stepped toward her with measured intent. When he spoke again, his voice was low, barely a whisper but filled with raw honesty. I was scared that I'd bring you into a story I wasn't sure had a happy ending. I didn't want to be your burden. I wanted to be your miracle. And when I realized I couldn't be, I left before I could ruin what little we had. She turned to face him now, tears streaking down her face, not from weakness but from release. Years of unspoken love, unacknowledged heartbreak, and unrealized dreams poured out in one glance. They stood there, face to face, like two versions of the same poem, written in different languages but meaning the same thing. You weren't my miracle, she whispered. You were my peace, and you took it with you. He didn't know what to say. He simply nodded as if accepting a sentence that had been waiting to be delivered. His hands trembled slightly. She noticed. She always noticed. Is it true, she asked, what you said earlier about not having months left? He hesitated, then gave a small nod. Liver, stage 4. They caught it too late. I've been on borrowed time for a while, but I didn't want anyone to know until I could face the one person who mattered. She exhaled, staggered by the cruelty of fate. Why didn't you tell someone sooner? Why not get treatment, go public, fight it? Keanu gave a tired smile. I've spent most of my life fighting what was invisible. Sadness, loneliness, meaning, when this came, I didn't see it as a battle. I saw it as a message. That maybe it was time to come home. Whatever home meant. I just didn't realize until too late that home was a person. Sandra's knees gave slightly and she reached for the mantel to steady herself. He stepped forward, instinctively catching her arm, and in that one touch, fragile and familiar, they both remembered everything. The way they once moved around each other like planets in orbit, never colliding but always held by something unspoken. Now gravity was pulling them back together in the final act. She turned toward him slowly and placed her hand over his. "Don't go yet," she whispered. He met her gaze. "I didn't come to leave, not this time." Her lips trembled. "Then stay, as long as you can. Let's not waste what we still have." There was no grand embrace, no dramatic kiss, just two broken hearts rediscovering their rhythm in a house that had been silent for far too long. They sat together again, this time closer, and Sandra leaned her head gently on his shoulder. For the next hour they didn't speak. There were no cameras, no scripts, no paparazzi, no lights. Only two souls, wrapped in old memories and uncertain tomorrows, resting in the one place where time had stopped, each other. A stranger at the breakfast table. Morning came not with the rush of alarms or the clatter of routine, but with a soft golden light spilling through the sheer curtains of Sandra's home, illuminating the quiet shapes of two people who had fallen asleep not in a lover's embrace, but in something more sacred, reconciliation. Keanu had nodded off on the couch, his head gently tilted toward her shoulder, and Sandra had stayed beside him, her hand resting over his heart, counting the seconds between breaths as if she could memorize each one. When she opened her eyes just after sunrise, she didn't move, she didn't speak. She simply watched him, tracing every new line in his face like it was a story she had never been told. He looked older, yes, but more human than ever. He looked like a man who had lived and loved, lost and returned, broken but unafraid. It wasn't until the sound of soft footsteps pattering down the hall reached her ears that she shifted slightly. A moment later, the door creaked, and her 10-year-old son, Louis, stepped into the living room still in his pajama shirt, rubbing his eyes. "Mom?" he asked groggily, his eyes widening when they landed on the figure seated beside her. Sandra sat up quickly, brushing her hair back and trying to ease the sudden tension. Keanu stirred as well, blinking against the light as he straightened. "Hey, buddy," Sandra said gently, smiling at her son. This is a friend of mine, an old friend." Louis blinked again, assessing the tall man with curious eyes. "Is he from the movies?" Keanu chuckled softly, scratching the back of his neck. "Some people say that, but mostly I just show up when it matters." Sandra smiled at the gentle humor in his tone. "Louis, this is Keanu. We worked together before you were born. He's visiting for a few days." Louis nodded politely but kept his distance. "Do you want breakfast?" Sandra looked at Keanu uncertain. He smiled. "I'd love some if you're sharing." The boy disappeared into the kitchen without another word, and Keanu turned to Sandra with a quiet breath of surprise. "He's taller than I thought he'd be." She nodded. "He's growing fast. He just turned 10 last month. I wanted to call you. I even drafted the message, but I didn't send it." "You should have," he whispered. "I didn't think you'd care," she admitted. "I would have shown up with 10 balloons and a card that made him laugh," Keanu said, half smiling but with a weight behind his eyes. "I may have left, Sandra, but I never stopped wondering what your world looked like without me in it." She looked at him, a silent wave of regret and gratitude washing over her. "Then maybe it's time you see it now." In the kitchen, Louis had somehow managed to spill orange juice on the floor while cracking eggs with all the care of a tornado. Sandra moved in quickly to help him, but Keanu followed behind, offering a dish towel and a grin that immediately made the boy pause. "You ever seen someone flip pancakes one-handed?" Keanu asked Louis, raising an eyebrow. The boy eyed him skeptically. "You can do that?" "Watch and learn." Sandra leaned against the doorway and watched as Keanu, despite a shaky start and one disastrous pancake stuck to the ceiling fan, had Louis giggling uncontrollably within minutes. It was surreal, like watching a part of her past slip effortlessly into her present, as if the universe had forgot to close a door years ago and was now quietly correcting its mistake. There was no awkwardness, no forced bonding, just a strange and beautiful rhythm that settled into the morning like it had always belonged. After breakfast, they all sat out on the back porch. Keanu sipped coffee slowly, the steam rising like unspoken thoughts between them. Louis sat beside him with a notepad, sketching something with the concentration of an artist and the patience of a child who didn't yet know the value of time. Every now and then, he would glance up at Keanu and ask random questions. What's your favorite movie you made? Probably the one that never got filmed. Did you ever want to be a superhero? Sometimes, but I was more of a quiet night type. Are you sick? That question came without warning, dropped like a pebble into still water, and the silence that followed rippled outward in waves of discomfort. Sandra froze, her heart thudding in her chest. Keanu, however, didn't flinch. He looked the boy in the eye, calm and steady. Yeah, he said softly, but I'm trying to make the most of every day I have. Louis nodded, not fully understanding but sensing the gravity. He offered Keanu a crayon drawing he'd been working on, a picture of a man with long hair holding a shield. You can be a quiet knight if you want, the boy said. I think they're cooler anyway. Keanu took the drawing like it was a priceless treasure. Thank you, Louis. That means more than you know. Later, when Louis went back inside to play video games, Sandra and Keanu remained on the porch. The sun was high now, casting warm rays across their faces. You were good with him, she said quietly. I never thought I'd get the chance to be. I used to imagine it sometimes, she whispered. You, me, a life where you didn't disappear. He turned toward her, his eyes glassy with emotion. And I used to imagine coming back, but I didn't think I'd be welcome. She reached for his hand then, not as a lover desperate for touch, but as someone who had waited too long for honesty. You're welcome now, she said. Maybe we can't fix the years we lost, but we can hold the ones we have left. Keanu stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. Then let's make every second count. And in that quiet morning light, two people who had been lost in time finally found a reason to stay grounded. Not for the cameras, not for the past, but for the beautiful, fragile, fleeting truth of now. The lake remembers everything. It was 2 days later when Sandra finally asked the question that had been forming in her mind since the moment Keanu walked back into her life. The idea had crept in quietly, like fog rolling over calm water, subtle at first, then suddenly there, wrapping itself around her until she couldn't ignore it anymore. She found him outside, sitting under the large oak tree in her backyard with Louis again, this time showing him how to carefully carve small wood pieces with gentle strokes. It was quiet, peaceful, too beautiful for the weight she was about to add to it. Hey, she said softly, standing near the tree, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Can I steal you away for the weekend? Keanu looked up, a smile curling on his lips. Depends. Am I going somewhere I've been before? Sandra nodded, and her eyes glimmered with something nostalgic. The lake house. His smile faded into something quieter, reverence maybe, recognition, a soft memory brushing against his heart. You kept it. She nodded. I couldn't let it go. It's been sitting there all these years. I haven't visited much lately. I guess I was waiting for the right time, or the right person. He set down the piece of wood in his hand and stood slowly, brushing the dust off his jeans. Let me just grab my jacket. The drive took 3 hours, but it felt like traveling through time. The farther they moved from the noise of the city, the more the silence between them turned warm, familiar. The radio played low in the background, an old folk song humming gently through the speakers. Sandra drove. Keanu watched the horizon with the air of a man trying to imprint every passing tree, every flutter of light on the windshield. There were moments neither of them spoke, but not because they didn't know what to say, because words would have only spoiled the sacredness of simply being near each other again. When they arrived, the lake house looked almost untouched by time. Tucked into a grove of evergreens, it sat quietly on the water's edge, just as it had the summer they first escaped there to write a script they never finished. The paint had faded, the deck was weathered, but it still held the same soul, timeless and patient, waiting for their return. Keanu stepped out of the car and stood still for a long moment, eyes locked on the reflection of the sky over the calm surface of the lake. It's exactly the same, he whispered. Even the air smells like memory. Sandra walked beside him, smiling. Do you remember the room with the broken door that never shut all the way? He nodded. That's where I told you I loved you for the first time. You were brushing your hair and dropped the comb. You scared me, she laughed. You said it so suddenly, so seriously. And then you didn't answer, he said, teasing gently. I didn't need to, she replied, her voice quieter now. You saw it in my eyes. They unpacked slowly, without hurry, as if the walls of the house required their presence to awaken. Sandra opened windows to let in the crisp autumn air while Keanu made a small fire in the hearth. They moved around each other like dancers returning to a choreography they hadn't practiced in years, sometimes clumsy, often graceful, but always in rhythm. That evening they sat on the porch overlooking the water, wrapped in old blankets, sipping wine from mismatched mugs. The stars slowly claimed the sky, and the moon stretched its reflection across the lake like a silver bridge to some other world. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we'd stayed together?" Sandra asked, not looking at him. "All the time," Keanu said without hesitation. "It was the biggest what-if of my life." "Then why didn't you come back sooner?" she whispered. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring into the dark. "Because I thought I needed to become someone better, someone who didn't carry ghosts, but the truth is, I never stopped being haunted. I just stopped letting anyone see it, including you." Sandra turned her head, her eyes tracing the lines on his face, etched deeper now but more meaningful. "You were always enough, even when you were broken." He looked at her then, his gaze heavier than the night sky. "And you were always the one I thought of when I wondered what love really looked like." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for a long time neither of them spoke. The fire crackled behind them, the lake lapped softly at the shore, and the stars spun silently overhead. They were no longer the version of themselves that met here years ago, full of dreams and promise. But they were something else now, two people who had walked through fire, who had lost and learned and returned. Late into the night, they wandered down to the old dock. It creaked under their steps, but held firm like it remembered them too. Keanu sat at the edge, his feet dangling over the water, and Sandra sat beside him, her knees pulled to her chest. "I never got to ask you," she said. "What made you come back now after all this time?" He took a long breath. "I had a dream a few weeks ago in the hospital. I was drifting in and out, and I saw us here, this exact place. You were standing in the doorway laughing at something I'd said, and it felt so real, so warm. I woke up with tears in my eyes. I told myself if I ever got one more week, one more chance, I'd come back to the place where I left my heart." She reached for his hand and intertwined her fingers with his. "Then maybe," she whispered, "it wasn't just a dream. Maybe it was a memory we hadn't lived yet." They stayed there until the cold made their bones ache, but neither of them wanted to move. Because for the first time in years, they weren't haunted by the past or afraid of the future. They were here together in a place that remembered everything they had forgotten, how to love simply, how to be present, how to find peace in each other's breath. And that night, when Sandra finally fell asleep in the room with the broken door, Keanu lay beside her, his hand over hers, his heart beating slowly but fully, as if the house, the lake, and love itself had decided to give them one more chapter before the final curtain closed. The secret he never meant to tell. The next morning at the lake house unfolded in a slow, unhurried rhythm that felt almost unreal, like waking up inside a memory that had patiently waited years to be lived. The sunlight spilled across the wooden floorboards in soft, golden streaks, warming the room with a tenderness that neither of them had felt in a very long time. Sandra stirred first, her eyes drifting open to the familiar creak of the old ceiling fan above, and for a moment she wondered if this was some beautiful illusion her mind had crafted to escape the reality of time. But when she turned slightly and saw Keanu lying beside her, his breathing slow, his face resting peacefully on the pillow, reality struck her with a force so gentle it felt like a prayer being answered. She stayed still, watching him for a long moment, taking in the way the morning light touched the edges of his hair, how his fingers twitched slightly as if holding on to something in a dream, and how, despite the weight he carried inside his body, he still looked like the man she once fell quietly, impossibly in love with. When he opened his eyes, she noticed immediately that something was different, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet heaviness behind his gaze, as though he had been awake long before she stirred, carrying a truth he wasn't sure he had the strength to share. He offered her a soft smile, but it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach its destination fully, like it lost its way somewhere between his heart and his lips. She reached for his hand beneath the blanket, and he tightened his fingers around hers, holding on as if grounding himself. "You slept well," she whispered, her voice still thick with the sweetness of dawn. He nodded slowly. "I sleep better here than anywhere else, maybe because this is the one place I never lied to myself." She felt her chest tighten at that, a subtle warning that something deeper was coming, but she didn't push. Instead, they walked outside together, barefoot on the cool wooden planks of the porch, watching the morning mist slowly rise from the surface of the lake. The water was still, so still it reflected the sky perfectly, as though nature itself held its breath for what the day would bring. Sandra prepared breakfast later, simple things, eggs and toast and strawberries she picked up from a small farm stand on the drive. But she noticed how Keanu barely touched his plate. He smiled through it, made a joke or two to ease her worry, but she saw the trembling in his hands and the way his breath shortened sooner than it should. She saw it all because she had learned to read him in the old days almost as easily as she read her scripts, and years apart had not erased that understanding. By midday, he asked if they could walk to the far edge of the lake, the place where a massive oak tree bent over the water like an old guardian protecting secrets. It was a path they used to take when they wanted to talk about things that scared them, things that mattered, things they never wanted anyone else to hear. The leaves crunched under their feet as they walked, and though the trail wasn't long, Keanu slowed halfway, placing a hand on his knee to steady himself. Sandra immediately stepped in, looping her arm through his. "You should have told me earlier if walking this far was hard for you," she said softly, though her worry strained her voice. He managed a small laugh. "I didn't want to look weak in front of you." "You don't," she said, and this time there was no hesitation. "Not ever." They reached the edge of the lake where the tree leaned over the water, its branches whispering with the wind. This spot held the echoes of a past they never fully lived, a place where he once read her unfinished poems, where she once confessed fears she had never told another soul, where he once traced circles on her wrist absent-mindedly while trying to find the right words for a script that never got made. And now, it would hold something else too. Keanu sank down onto the old bench beneath the tree, breathing carefully, and Sandra sat beside him, waiting. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and the softness of approaching autumn. He took her hand again, and his thumb ran gently along the side of her palm as he stared out at the water. "There's something I didn't tell you," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper but sharp enough to slice through the silence between them. "Something I didn't mean to hide, but I didn't know how to bring it up without hurting you." Sandra froze slightly, not out of fear, but out of bracing herself against the unknown. "Whatever it is, just tell me," she said. "We don't have time for secrets." He exhaled, long and slow, as though releasing a burden he'd carried too far. "The doctors didn't just tell me that I'm running out of time. They gave me an estimate." A cold shiver ran through her, as if the wind itself had suddenly turned cruel. She squeezed his hand. "How long?" He closed his eyes, as though saying the number aloud would make it more real. 6 weeks, maybe less." The words hit her like a wave she wasn't prepared to survive. She felt her lungs tighten, her heart stagger, her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to scream at the universe, to demand why after all these years, after all the silence and heartbreak and absence, why now, why bring him back only to rip him away again? But she held all of that inside because he didn't tell her this for her pain. He told her this because he trusted her with the truth. She didn't speak for a long time. Instead, she rested her head on his shoulder, letting the tears slip silently down her face and fall onto his shirt. He placed a gentle kiss on the top of her head, his hand coming up to cradle her cheek as though holding something impossibly fragile. "I didn't want you to spend your days worrying," he murmured. "I didn't want to be a countdown." "You're not a countdown," she said, lifting her face to him, her eyes red but fierce. "You're a life that mattered to mine, and I am not going to waste 1 minute of whatever time we have left." He stared at her then, a long, searching look, as though committing every detail of her face to memory. The delicate line of her jaw, the soft curve of her lips, the strength in her eyes that had once saved him without either of them realizing it. He lifted his hand and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, letting his fingers linger on her cheek. "There's something else," he said, voice tremoring. "Something I should have said years ago." She held his gaze. "Then say it now." His voice broke as he whispered, "I never stopped loving you." The world seemed to still around them. No wind, no bird calls, no rustling leaves. Only the sound of the truth, finally free, finally spoken in the place where it always belonged. Her tears fell harder now, but not from sadness, from a love that had been buried so deep it never died, only waited. "I loved you then," she whispered back, her voice full and trembling. "And I love you now, I never stopped either." He closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him like a blessing. For a long time they stayed beneath the oak tree, wrapped in each other, wrapped in a truth that came too late, and yet somehow arrived exactly when the heart needed it. And as the sun dipped lower, casting a warm amber glow across the lake, Sandra made a vow, not out loud, not in dramatic words, but silently, fiercely, deep within the core of who she was. She would not let him face a single remaining day alone. She would walk with him through every sunrise left, every sunset still waiting, every breath, every laugh, every ache, every hour. She would not lose him to time without giving him a kind of love that didn't fear endings. She would give him the kind of ending that felt like a beginning. The last sunrise he chose to see. The following weeks passed in a rhythm so gentle that it felt like time itself was tiptoeing around them, careful not to disturb the fragile holiness of their remaining days together. Sandra created a small universe inside the lake house, one where fear was acknowledged but never allowed to take the lead, where every hour was treated like an heirloom too precious to drop, and where Keanu began each morning wrapped in the warmth of a life he had once walked away from but had now returned to with a depth of gratitude impossible to articulate. She cooked meals he used to love, even though some days he barely touched the food. She read to him on nights when his breathing grew shallow. She held his hand during quiet afternoons when fatigue weighed on his body like a slow tide rising. And through all of it, she never let him feel like he was fading, only changing, only transitioning into something softer, something gentler, something that required love instead of strength. Louis visited on weekends, filling the house with laughter that seemed to melt the heaviness resting on their hearts. The boy had accepted Keanu with a natural openness that only children possess, unburdened by the complications adults attach to emotions. He'd sit on the floor drawing pictures or telling stories, unaware that the man beside him was memorizing the sound of his voice as if he were carving it into stone. One evening, Louis had brought a handmade paper crown and placed it carefully on Keanu's head, saying simply, "You're my quiet knight," a title Keanu cherished more than any award he had ever received. Sandra watched that moment with a mixture of joy and sorrow, understanding that her son had been given a gift, a memory of kindness wrapped in simplicity, that would shape his view of strength forever. As the days passed, the illness grew bolder, stealing small pieces of Keanu's stamina each morning while he tried to hide the evidence from her. He would step outside for fresh air, only to return breathless. He would attempt to chop wood for the fireplace, his hands trembling so violently that Sandra had to step in before he even lifted the axe. He tried, with all the gentleness of a man who wanted to shield the woman he loved from inevitable grief, to pretend he was not leaving. But Sandra was not blind to him. She could read every wince, every labored breath, every pause he took before standing, and she refused to let fear dictate how she loved him. One night, when the wind howled outside and the fire inside burned low, Keanu reached for her hand with a trembling softness that made her chest ache. "I need to tell you something," he whispered, his voice thin but sincere. "In these past weeks, you've given me more life than the last 10 years combined. I thought I was returning to say goodbye, but you gave me reasons to wish I could stay." She leaned in, her forehead pressing gently against his. "You did stay, right here, with me. That's all I ever wanted. I don't need years, Keanu. I needed you now." He closed his eyes, his breath shaking. "You gave me a home I never thought I deserved. And you gave me a love I never thought I would get again," she whispered back. Later that night, after he fell asleep, she sat beside him and watched the firelight dance gently across his face, studying every feature as if she could preserve them in her heart forever. His eyelashes fluttered in dreams. His fingers twitched softly against the blanket. His chest rose and fell, slow and uneven, like the tide pulling back from the shore. She held his hand the entire night, not because she was afraid to lose him, but because she wanted to honor every second she still had. It was during the 5th week that he woke before dawn and touched her arm with an unexpected surge of clarity. The sky outside was still dark, holding the faintest promise of morning. He smiled as she stirred, and she knew instantly that something was different, not wrong, just different, as though an understanding had settled inside him quietly during the night. "Can we go to the lake?" he asked. "I want to watch the sunrise there one last time." The words cut her heart open with their gentleness, but she didn't let it show. She nodded and helped him sit up, letting him lean against her as they slowly made their way through the house and out onto the back porch. The air was cold enough to bite their skin, but the sky was warming, shifting slowly from deep midnight blue to shades of violet and soft rose. She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and he leaned into her, letting his head rest against her temple as they walked toward the dock hand in hand. The old wooden boards creaked softly under their feet, just as they had years ago, just as they had weeks ago. They sat at the edge together, Sandra holding him close, supporting more of his weight than she had before. He stared out at the still water, his breathing shallow but steady, eyes glowing with a quiet peace she hadn't seen before. "This place," he murmured, "was always our true script. Not Hollywood, not the movies, just this. You, me, the lake, silence. I didn't know it back then, but I know it now." She pressed a kiss to his temple, her tears silent but constant. "I'm here. I'm right here." He took a slow breath, one that trembled like the last leaf on a tree in winter. "Promise me something, Sandra." "Anything," she whispered. "When I'm gone, don't close yourself off. Don't let my absence build walls around your life. You deserve laughter. You deserve mornings like this. You deserve love that stays." "I'm never letting you go," she whispered fiercely. "You don't have to," he said with a faint smile. "I'll stay here in the lake, in the house, in the memories you carry. I'll stay in every sunrise you watch, but promise me you'll keep living, fully, wildly, without fear." "I promise," she breathed, though it shattered her. The first light of the sun broke over the horizon then, spilling gold across the water in a gentle shimmer. Keanu's eyes reflected the glow, soft and steady, as though he were watching the universe open its arms to him. He squeezed her hand one last time, tender and slow, and leaned his head on her shoulder with a breath that carried gratitude, love, acceptance, and an ending. And in the quiet embrace of dawn, surrounded by the place that held their beginning, Keanu Reeves slipped peacefully into the sunrise. Sandra didn't cry out. She didn't scream. She held him tightly, held him with every ounce of love she had carried for years, and she whispered, "Thank you for coming back to me." The sun continued rising. The world continued breathing. The lake reflected the sky's brilliance as though honoring him. And Sandra, wrapped in the weight of his loss and the warmth of his love, made one final vow, that every sunrise she witnessed for the rest of her life would be shared with him, in the silent, sacred spaces of her heart where he would live forever.